Well, welcome everyone. Just sit tight as we allow everyone to come into the webinar, and we'll be with you in just a moment. Again, if you're just joining us, just sit tight and we'll begin in just a moment. We'll give it just another minute. I'm watching our participant counter and I can see people coming into the webinar. Sunny is busy admitting people. We'll give him just another minute. Again, welcome. We'll give it just another minute. Got a few more I see who are joining, and so we'll begin momentarily. I'm watching our participant counter. It's just starting to slow down. I assume we've just about got everybody admitted into the webinar. Yeah, it looks like it's stabilizing there. So we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome everyone. It's Len Jessup, president here at Claremont Graduate University. Welcome to our latest installment of CGU in Conversation. We've got some fun things in store for you today. You can see I'm joined here by Karen and Jenny, whom I'll introduce here in a moment, and then we'll get started. And I'm looking at all my signals coming in from Command Central. I think we're ready. So I'll begin by introducing Karen Danielsen-Lang. Some of you might have been expecting Rob Lang to be here. Rob, unfortunately, couldn't be here with us at the last moment. So Karen has graciously agreed to step in for Rob. Some of you, I'm sure, on the webinar already know Karen, but for those who don't, a quick introduction that Karen is an associate professor in public policy and leadership at UNLV. I know Karen quite well from my time at UNLV. She got her PhDs from Virginia Tech, and her areas of study fit really well with what we're doing today in urban planning theory, and in particular, national housing policy and growth around that, and how it relates to urban design, private governance, discrimination, and a number of other topics that are spot on for what we'll talk about today with Jenny. And you might recognize the last name. There is a connection between Rob and Karen as well. But Karen, good to have you with us here today. Thank you so much. We're going to hit 90 in Claremont. How about up there in Las Vegas, or Henderson, should I say?
I live actually in the county, so I'm not in Henderson, but yes, it's going to be somewhere around 90. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And Karen will be my partner in crime today as we speak, as we do in our format today with our guest, Jenny Schuetz. Jenny joins us from Brookings. We've had a Brookings speaker, and Jenny also is a senior fellow at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program and is an expert in urban economics and housing policy. And in our prep work leading up to today's CGU in Conversation, we've had some riveting conversations about housing, especially right now during COVID. Some very interesting things going on and some interesting public solutions that are being offered. Dr. Schuetz has written numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on land use regulation, housing prices, urban amenities, and neighborhood change. And her work, in addition to appearing in scholarly journals, has appeared in outlets such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and many, many others. She's spent a lot of time in higher ed, in addition to out on the public policy side. And while Karen comes to us from Virginia Tech, Jenny's got a PhD in public policy from Harvard University and a master's from MIT and a BA in economics and political social thought from the University of Virginia. So Jenny, welcome and thank you. We're delighted to have you with us today in our Q&A.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry I don't get to be in beautiful Southern California.
You were, it looks like, at home in Washington, D.C. today.
That's correct.
And just for grins, what kind of weather are you expecting there today? We'll see how it compares.
We're getting the beginning of summer, so we're also in the mid 80s, but unlike you, very high humidity. And the hot topic of conversation in DC at the moment is actually the cicadas. We're expecting a 17-year crop, and that's bumped almost everything off of the top local news.
Well, those are disgusting.
You're very loud.
No, not just that, they're all over the sidewalks and you start walking on them in some places. It's really gross.
because this year wasn't strange enough.
Yeah, exactly. Well, welcome, and just feel free to mute if they get too loud in the background. All right, let's get started. And just to tee something up kind of easy to begin with, how did you, Jenny, how did you get into this? What drew you into this work? Was there something that happened early on, maybe an early influence or event or something that got you interested in this path that you were on?
Sure. Housing is one of those fields I feel like you fall into it by accident and you either like it and stay with it or you don't. And I fell into it after college. My first job was working at a place called Apt Associates, which did a lot of consulting for HUD, working with housing authorities. And that was an interesting time to be doing it because the Clinton administration, if I can date myself, was unrolling a lot of new programs that allowed housing authorities more authority, more ability to kind of manage their properties as a portfolio, kind of like a private real estate owner. And that was a set of skills that they didn't have because they'd never been allowed to do it before. And so we worked with a lot of them to help think about their market conditions and circumstances. And it's really a persistent problem. How do government agencies help very low income families live in decent quality housing in neighborhoods where they have access to opportunity, access to jobs, transportation, safe streets and good schools for their kids? How do we help people find that? And how do local governments do that in a way that fits into their market context? And really all of the conversations beyond that are sort of variations on making our existing programs work better, some of which are about the amount of money that we spend on it, and some of which are the way we design and implement programs.
And along the way, while your formal education and training was back east, you spent time out here in our part of our neck of the woods, as they say, as a professor at USC. And so you know our housing situation. But before we get into those issues, or that the regional issues here, what drew you to USC, and how was the time here in SoCal?
Yeah, well, USC has a terrific real estate program. And so they recruited me to come out from New York, where I was at the time, to join the real estate program, which was a terrific opportunity to get to know California. The West Coast housing markets are very different than the East Coast. The cities are really different. The structure is different. So I had lived in DC and Boston and New York, which are old cities with compact city centers and a lot of public transit infrastructure. And of course, Southern California is a very spread out region. It has really expensive housing. It has some interesting geographic constraints, and has created some policy messes for itself at the state level, which it's still trying to dig out of. And then in addition, local governments in California have chosen to make it quite difficult to build housing, especially lower cost housing. You're sitting in Claremont, the entire Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino, the kind of eastward development from Los Angeles is in some ways because Los Angeles doesn't build enough housing on the west side. And so people out to the fringes looking for places that housing is a little bit less expensive. But on the flip side, then imposing really high transportation costs on people who have to commute very long distances.
Yeah. Yeah, I just recently did the drive back out. We're at, right on the edge here in Claremont of LA County, and we've got Riverside and San Bernardino counties to the east of us. And I recently did the drive all the way back out through the end of the basin, if you will. And we are pretty much built out to the edges, much like Las Vegas is now, built out almost all the way to the edges of the mountain ranges around. But that is certainly the case here in the 909. There is not much open space left here in the LA basin.
Which raises some real questions. If the population continues to grow and you've kind of built up all of the land, the natural response is that you need to go up at some point, start building vertically instead of horizontally.
Yeah.
That raises some challenges with where are you going to do that, and are the rents high enough to support taller construction?
Yeah.
I also saw that there was stuff on drought warnings now too. So we're also facing limitations for development from water restraints. Climate change isn't helping that, obvious.
Yeah. And Karen, you knew Jenny before this, so how had you interacted with her before? Through a
Well, we
panel
did
or a paper or?
Yeah, a panel a couple of years ago at UNLV. She was talking about the middle class and housing challenges, mostly in Las Vegas, but comparing it to national trends. And Richard Reeves, another colleague of hers, was on the panel as well.
Excellent.
So
Jenny, set the scene for us. If you sort of go back a little bit, pre-pandemic, so before we're in the situation that we're in right now, we got a lot of questions about that and how it's affecting housing. But before that, what were the issues that you were studying sort of before COVID-19 comes to the scene?
Yeah, no, it's definitely helpful context to remember that even before the pandemic started, housing affordability was a serious issue for a lot of households, particularly lower income households. So the poorest 20% of households everywhere in the US just have trouble paying the rent or the mortgage. It's true both for renters and for homeowners, and it's true everywhere in the country, not just expensive places like Los Angeles and DC, but even in small towns and rural areas, poor people just have difficulty affording sort of minimum quality housing everywhere in the country without spending half of their income on rent, right? And we know that that's bad because then they can't consume healthcare and transportation and all of the other things they need. So housing affordability was a serious stressor for poor families. We had people who were spending half of their income on rent before the pandemic. We also know that there were some regional problems, particularly in places like California, Seattle and Portland, also in the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast Corridor, places that essentially haven't been building enough housing to keep up with demand and population growth for almost 30 years now. So these sort of really high cost markets along both of the coasts have created a problem where housing supply just doesn't meet demand. And so even middle income households were having a hard time affording the quality of house and the size of house that they wanted in those communities. So those were sort of the two problems we had going into the pandemic. We also know that in general, the sort of changing distribution of income in the country, there are many households who have high paid jobs, who have a lot of assets and are able to spend a lot of money on housing, which effectively drives up prices. And on the other hand, wages for the median household have been stagnating, right? So we have this divergence that shows up in housing markets just as it does in labor markets.
Interesting. And Karen, feel free to jump in at any point.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's also there's a housing idea that people talk about is how people used to afford housing. It used to be through filtering, where you'd build new houses and then older houses would become affordable. We're seeing in some of these large cities that the land is so valuable because we're running out of land, that gentrification or people tearing down houses and rebuilding more expensive housing is eliminating a lot of affordable housing units for that reason. So it's just another, whack at any kind of, sustainable, affordable housing preservation too. So we have two things, everything is pointing or trying to target richer people. And we are really not looking at trying to let affordable housing be built for the poorest of the poor, which is what the government traditionally did through public housing. And that's a disaster too. And then through even like lower income people or working or the working poor, what they usually call them. So they're actually working for minimum wage, but they actually can't really afford the house, and they're paying more of their income, as Jenny was saying before. So, and I just want to say one other thing. There's a interesting way of looking at this, and Jenny's probably familiar with this too, that there's this idea of a housing wage that the National Low Income Housing puts out like every year. And just to get a sense of how much it costs for someone to really afford a house, just to get a 1-bedroom house in like Los Angeles, a 1-bedroom apartment, I mean, it's $29 an hour approximately. And if you worked at minimum wage, which is $13 in the Los Angeles area, you'd have to work 90 hours to afford that apartment. It's just a very modest apartment. And even Las Vegas it's like almost $17 an hour, but minimum wage here is $9, and you'd have to work 73 hours to at least afford that 1-bedroom apartment. So just to get a sense of scale of how much there's a big gap there. So, at least in Las Vegas, it's minimum wage is $9, so it's more than, it's about double what you really need in order to afford a house. And in Los Angeles, it's about double what you need actually to afford a 1-bedroom house. So, and even at that, you'd probably be working like a significant amount of hours. So it's just, kind of really discouraging. A lot of this is income problem where we're not paying people enough at all levels. And the minimum wage would certainly help in that regard, because you could just even see that even having a $15 wage would be affordable, close to affordable here in Las Vegas. And some of the other cities that she was looking at, like it's none of the minimum wage in each one of those states is enough to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. So
interesting. Jenny, I noticed in your bio that you'd worked with I think it was called the Future of the Middle Class, an initiative or a project, and was that designed around these housing issues that Karen is talking about in affordability?
It's not specific to housing. So the Future of the Middle Class initiative at Brookings is an attempt to kind of get a sense of how middle class households are doing, threats to households falling out of the middle class, and also difficulty for people who are poor rising into the middle class. And we actually look across a number of different areas. So we have some focus on education and training, on savings, on time use, because time is a real squeeze on middle class families. So housing was one of the components. One of the others was also looking at automation. One of the threats to a lot of sort of standardized jobs is that as they become automated, either hours get cut or jobs get eliminated. So the Brookings was looking across a number of different areas and trying to figure out, what is it that's making middle class existence precarious, right? So even people who earn what we think of as a middle class income often have a pretty high level of anxiety that they're not going to be able to maintain that, and they're not going to be able to pass it on to their kids. Some of this is, as Karen said, there's been a stagnation of wages. People aren't earning as much, but a lot of it is things like the expenses. So if you have healthcare expenses that you have to pay out of pocket, housing expenses, saving money for your kids to go to college, or paying off your existing student loans, all of these essentially take money out of your pocket and make the middle class existence really pretty precarious.
Yeah. And we're getting questions coming in, and they're kind of jumping around. I was trying to kind of do pre-pandemic and then pandemic proper, and then what's the expectation after. So I'm just saying to some of our participants, I see some of the questions that are wanting to jump ahead, and we'll get there. As you think back, so you mentioned sort of back to the Clinton administration, you think forward through the Bush administration and Obama and forward, and you think about the national kind of federal approaches to try to solve this issue. Were they things that were done that set us up well for pandemic? Did they help at the time? Did they help set us up for the pandemic issues that we are now faced with? What's your feeling there?
Yeah, that's sort of a tricky question. So we don't have a particularly coherent federal housing policy. We have a couple of different policies that deal with different parts of the market. The federal government has taken on more responsibility traditionally for helping very low income households afford housing either through public housing, which is housing that the government builds and owns and manages and then subsidizes for low-income households to live in. Actually, the largest housing subsidy program for low-income households is the voucher program, which essentially gives low-income households the equivalent of cash to rent an apartment from a private landlord. So there's sort of this bucket of programs to subsidize very low income, primarily renter households. And that pot of money has been shrinking over time relative to the number of households who need it. So part of what we saw with the sort of insecurity of poor households is that the government just doesn't spend enough money to take care of them. And we are considerably stingier than most other developed countries in providing support for low-income renters. Then the other big piece of federal housing policy focuses on mortgages for the owner-occupied market, and that's really more geared towards middle and upper income households. So we have a whole set of agencies, for instance, that regulate the mortgage market, partly through the banking system and partly directly. We have the two large government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which provide mortgages essentially at a subsidized interest rate for people who can afford to buy homes. And we have federal tax incentives for people to buy homes and to buy more expensive homes. So that's sort of the high end of the market, higher income homeowners, then with low income renters. But the federal government doesn't do a whole lot for kind of households in the middle. If you qualify for a federally backed mortgage, you're getting an implicit subsidy. Tax policy has been changing a little bit so that most middle income households actually don't get a tax benefit from owning their own home rather than renting. That changed a couple of years ago with the tax reform. But one of the areas where the federal government has very little leverage is on housing supply, right? So mortgages are about housing demand, your ability to buy a house. The federal government is pretty hands-off with respect to building more homes. Land use is controlled by local governments for the most part in this country. And so local governments decide how much of the land within a city or town is available for housing versus commercial purposes or open space. Of the land that's set aside for housing, what kinds of homes can you build? What's the process of building homes? Can you build single family or apartment buildings? Do they have to have a large lot or can they be on small lots? Decisions about housing supply that are really important for prices and availability are made by local governments. We have 40,000 local governments across the country that are all making these decisions essentially in isolation. And then we wind up with things like the whole state of California that underbuilds housing because it's got all of these local decisions that collectively add up to a regional shortage. One of the things that we're seeing from the Biden administration is more interest in the federal government engaging with housing supply, encouraging local governments to make it easier to build housing, particularly smaller housing that would be more affordable to low and moderate income households.
You mentioned California, and we had chatted about this in our prep session, and it's just anecdotal, but one of my brothers, my younger brother, lives just outside of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in a little town called Post Falls. They would consider that in town, sort of, it's a suburb of Coeur d'Alene. I think most Californians would look at Post Falls and think that it looks quite rural compared to what we're used to here, at least in Southern California. But in any event, this was happening pre-pandemic and it's just sped up, but the migration, inward migration into Idaho of Californians has seemed to have sped up recently, at least it feels that way. And the data point, and it's anecdotal, but just for his property, his home on Zillow is now, but this goes back now, he bought it so maybe a year or so before pandemic, but the value of his house has been on this steep curve in the last year, and it's easily doubled. And he's out in a suburb closer to the lake, around Lake Coeur d'Alene, sort of like Lake Tahoe would be the equivalent here in California. But things around the lake have as much as tripled in the last year and a half. And so there's clearly something going on there, and it's sped up in the last year. And what do you have to say about that kind of migration going on right now, whether it's West Coast based or wherever it might be happening?
Yeah. So for the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a pretty consistent trend of people moving out of the biggest metro areas, places like LA, San Francisco, New York, Boston, people moving out of the biggest and most expensive metro areas to smaller cities that have traditionally been lower cost places. So Boise, Idaho has been one of the hottest housing markets for about the last 5 or 6 years. places like Denver, Nashville. Las Vegas has had a lot of people moving from California. So part of what's happening is that people who are essentially priced out of these high cost markets, say, younger households who are renters, they get ready to buy a house or they need a little more space if they have kids, they can't make that leap and have something that is affordable and enough space and gives them the lifestyle they want. And so they leave and move to a place that's somewhat cheaper, that gives them a little bit more space. And if you think of, if you're moving from Los Angeles to Las Vegas or to Boise, Idaho, prices and rents look so cheap. You can get so much more house for the same amount of money. So what that does is then drive up the prices of these places they're moving to, particularly the homeowners who are downsizing, who are moving. They have so much cash that they can spend on housing that it drives up those local markets. And this is a trend that predates the pandemic and is mostly about housing costs and affordability, but has sped up during the pandemic as people want even more to have an extra bedroom, to have some outdoor space. They're maybe able to work from home. And so they've wanted to do a move like this, and now they're able to do it. Definitely having an impact on the receiving markets.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. And I just saw the census. And so how I'm trying to remedy what you just said about this migration with the census data that suggested continued movement south and west. But maybe just the way that it jibes with what you said about those metro areas is it might be west, but just not smack in the middle of a metro area is the most popular place to go. It may be Boise or somewhere else in the west.
Or it's west and then you move back east a little.
Yes, a loop, boom, Boise, Reno.
Boise or Phoenix from Los Angeles or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing that people are frustrated with the amount of money they have to spend on often very small housing and not necessarily great quality housing, right? I lived in Boston for 7 years and housing there is very expensive and it's still old and it's in poor quality and it's really expensive to heat and cold because it's not insulated. And so when people are spending all of their time at home and they need extra space and the quality of your living environment matters a lot, people have just decided it's not worth doing that. I have the chance to move someplace that has a nice lifestyle, but gives me a little bit more space for the money.
Yeah. That's kind of a good lead in maybe to start talking about things during pandemic with COVID, because that's one of the potentially positive outcomes has been that it is not, we're not so much tethered now between the job and the location of the home, and it's allowed people to say have that job in Silicon Valley that they really wanted, but at astronomic Manhattan like housing costs that maybe and the way they were solving that was they would live outside these little towns just outside the Bay Area and then do a 2-hour drive to get to that Silicon Valley job. And now they don't, at least during lockdown, during pandemic, they don't need to do that so much anymore. So that's added an interesting wrinkle, I think, to the tether between job and home location that has been freed a little bit during pandemic.
Yeah, and there are potentially some really interesting ripple effects if work from home sticks around, do this for the long run. So that's definitely one of the big questions. We don't yet know whether that's going to become a permanent feature, but there are a couple of different ways it could play out. One is if people are allowed to work remotely from anywhere, so they never have to go in the office, then you can keep your job in Silicon Valley or in New York finance and move anywhere in the country you want to. And so you can open up, places in the middle of the country, rural areas where you can go hiking, outside of your backyard. The other possibility, though, is that some places are likely to do a hybrid model. So you need to be in the office 1 to 2 days a week,
sometimes
4 days a month or something like that, but you still have to be in the office sometimes. And if that's the case, people aren't going to leave the Bay Area and move to Idaho, but they're going to move farther out. So they're going to move to places like Sacramento, where you can still get into the Bay Area to your job if you need to. And the long commute once a week or twice a week is easier to do. So these are really different implications between people moving across metros and people staying in the same metro area, but moving to less expensive places, probably that are out farther in the suburbs or exurbs.
Right. Yeah. Or in that instance, it could be you'd want to be up near the lake, like Tahoe. You can't afford to be there, but you might be in Truckee. And then if it's just once a week that you need to come down to be in an all staff meeting, you could do that. That you could make that work. But ordinarily you couldn't possibly commute from there every single day. I think that plays out here in Southern California as well. in the decisions people are making and how far out they live.
Yeah.
You know, you might want to talk about that in terms of how lower income families are not able to do that and how that affects them too. Because
Yeah, if you're in a service job, you've got to be there every day.
right, so it's not going to affect everybody equally, even if there is a long-term change.
Yeah.
No, it's true. And one of the things that I worry about is the dense downtowns, the places that had a lot of jobs, that had a lot of office space together. They support a lot of other businesses and a lot of jobs, not just high paid, engineers or the finance jobs, but all of the coffee shops and the restaurants where people go to lunch and people go to the dry cleaners on their way into the office and back. So there's an enormous ecosystem of kind of supporting businesses with jobs at a lot of different wage points. And what we've seen in the pandemic is it's food service, it's leisure and hospitality, it's the in-person sectors that have been hit the hardest because people aren't able to be in a space with others, right? And so, and the jobs that were located in those dense office clusters in Midtown Manhattan and downtown DC, those businesses have taken an enormous hit. We don't know what's going to happen to the workers. So people who worked in a coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan, if many of the workers there choose to move out to Long Island and stay there, it's not like you can go set up coffee shops in every suburban community in Long Island and in upstate New York. People just don't use those services as much when they're at home. And so there's a potential that we're going to have a real loss of particularly small businesses in supporting industries that employ a lot of low-wage workers. Those places are going to take a hit, and it's not clear what's going to happen.
Interesting. There's concern that, especially during COVID, that this phenomenon you're talking about has had sort of an unequal effect on people from underrepresented groups versus not. And is that, which is a legitimate concern, and are you seeing that happening in the data that you see? Yes. Would you explain?
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of this starts with the labor market impacts. So the biggest job losses have been for workers making under $30,000 a year, primarily in food service, in hospitality. Karen can talk some about Las Vegas, because certainly all of the places that really depend heavily on tourism have taken a hit. I mean, the hotel sector has really been decimated. So lots of those jobs, and those are not only low wage, but they tend to be occupied by Black or brown people, and a lot of them are disproportionately female. A lot of the food service jobs and hospitality and housekeeping jobs are more weighted towards female workers. So you've got the hit on the labor side. You've also got the problem of schools being closed and low-income families not being able to put their kids in childcare to go back and take a job, even if it comes available. And of course, the health impacts of COVID have been disproportionately felt by Black and Latino families. So that's sort of the triple whammy. Jobs aren't there. They can't necessarily take jobs if you've got family at home anyway, and the health impacts. And so that it's really been disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable families. I worry too a little bit if high income professionals can physically move themselves away from cities, from urban areas, if they're no longer taking the subway or the bus to work, they're not interacting with people on the streets around their office, they're mostly surrounded by people who are like them. And they think everybody is working from home, everybody still has a job, everybody is upgrading to a nicer house. And that's obviously just not true. But we get more of a separation, physical separation, between people who are doing well economically and people who are vulnerable. And that's not great for reaching better policies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could just talk about I saw an article in the paper, and I was kind of surprised about this, that they're seeing the tourism industry actually recovering sooner than they expected, which is kind of odd. And I would expect that, maybe it's just because there's obviously a pent up demand, and, the nature of what people come here for, it's more adult oriented. I would suspect, and I haven't really looked at the numbers, that Orlando is probably worse off because of the nature of who they serve, like, mostly because it's Disneyland and children and all that stuff. So there's people probably who are not, or Orlando's probably going to suffer, longer term downturn or recovery than someplace like Las Vegas. I haven't looked at the numbers for New Orleans, but I suspect that's similar for them too, because they also cater to a more adult or, young adult, clientele. So. Yeah.
Well, I tell you just again, anecdotally, but we spend a lot of time back and forth with Christy and I between Las Vegas and here. And on the 15, the freeway that you drive, it's already back to the pre-pandemic backups that, on Friday on the way up and Sunday on the way down, you can't touch the 15. So it's all there. I don't know where they're going and what they're doing, but they're going up there on the weekends and have been for a few months. It's been pretty busy.
Surprisingly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly going to be true that over the next few months, as more people are vaccinated and feel comfortable getting out, people haven't been on vacation in a year and a half. So there is a lot of pent up demand. There's also going to be a lot of demand for going to visit family who you haven't seen for a long time once it's safe to do that. So I would anticipate that, travel is already picking up. There will be more of that. Hopefully people will be smart about it and be safe about it and not put other people at risk. We worry particularly about workers in the hospitality sector who need to go back to work because they need the paycheck. But if they themselves haven't yet been vaccinated, they're at higher risk because somebody else wants to take a vacation.
Yeah.
And gas prices, I was just going to say, gas prices are expected to go up too in the summer just because of that pent up demand. So that's not doesn't just affect people who are going on vacation. It affects everybody who has to go to work too. So that's probably going to be a burden on people's budgets.
I'll try to tie together two questions. And one was about, so with people pulling away and working remotely, I think it is is that leaving empty real estate? And if it is, would then prices be coming down maybe and making it more affordable? But my sense is it's just people are swooping in and buying that. And I see prices going up, which is odd almost everywhere I look. And the related question is that investment? What's the percentage of investment purchases, not necessarily to live, but people thinking, I'm going to buy this stuff now. It's a good deal. It's a good investment. It's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like the labor market. We're really seeing a lot of variation in different parts of the housing market. So we talked a little bit about the owner-occupied market and the rental market kind of going in different directions. The owner-occupied market has seen really high sales volume and increasing prices, particularly in desirable locations, as people who sort of just, have been renting for a while and they decide, okay, it's time, I need the extra space, I'm going to take the plunge and become a homeowner. So we're seeing increased prices for owner-occupied homes and mostly single-family homes. So the condo market is doing terribly. Condos are sitting vacant because people aren't willing to buy those at the moment. So that's one of the soft areas. But if you think about sort of where people are moving from when they buy their first house, a lot of them are coming from the rental side, kind of the high end of the rental market, right? So they've been living in, Chicago or New York in a pretty apartment building. They move out to buy a home. That opens up a space in that apartment building that they were in. And there's some softness in that area. So the top end of the rental market is seeing rents dip a little bit. They're seeing an increase in vacancies because people maybe aren't willing to move in there. Some of this is also people who are, say, finishing college or finishing graduate school have delayed moving to a new city for a job. And so there's that softness, particularly in kind of the core urban markets in the rental market. But what's really interesting is at the bottom of the rental market, sort of the cheapest market rate housing, there's more competition because a bunch of people who have lost some hours and jobs have to downsize or have to downgrade their apartment. So we're actually seeing rents go up for the cheapest apartments while rents are going down at the top end of the rental market. And there's a number of places like Chicago where you see this sort of real divergence between the top and the bottom of the rental market. And of course, the problem is poor families are at the bottom and have nowhere else to go. They now have more competition for those apartments. And in some cases, landlords are raising the rent, which is really putting a squeeze on people.
I was just going to say that I think that, I don't know what the actual percentage of investment is, but I know that there was an article done by one of your colleagues, Alan Malik, a few years ago on Las Vegas. And I think something like, I want to say like 30% of all the sales at that time during that last downturn were to investors. So that actually leaves like a really weird dynamic in housing markets because they're all investors and they're renting. And so the nature of neighborhoods change and the nature of how people care for their houses change. It's not like having a real neighbor. So it changes like even the quality of neighborhoods. But so I'm not sure how it's going to shake out here, especially since we're still having high demand for housing. So we're not really seeing like very high eviction rates yet. We're seeing more eviction rates, not what was it? Foreclosure, I meant to say, but we're seeing high eviction rates on the other side. So I don't know if the housing market's going to really, I mean, they'll see a lot more investment, I guess, but I'm not seeing so much it's shifting that much to investors as yet, because I think people who are wanting to live in their houses and not using it for investment are still not, that's not changed yet, I don't think, just because of the nature of the foreclosures.
Yeah, there's less turnover in the owner-occupied, the for sale stock than there was in the last downturn for sure. But there is also some turnover in rental properties. So, smaller landlords who maybe owned, a duplex or a couple of, a smaller apartment building, many of those landlords are having trouble making their payments, right? If you've got a 4-unit building and one of your tenants loses their job and can't pay the rent, that's a quarter of your rental income. So we're seeing some of the smaller properties where landlords are having trouble keeping up with their payments, and they may have to sell those. So there's likely to be some turnover in kind of the smaller, older apartment buildings.
There's a question just come in very timely about the potential for an eviction crisis, or on a related note, a home loan default crisis, and what might be done to help to stem the tide of that. Either of those.
The federal government has been thinking about that for a year now and has been trying to get out in front of it. It's more successful on the owner-occupied market, in part because homeowners have just done better. They've been less likely to lose their jobs. Housing prices are still strong. So if you're a homeowner and you can't make your payments, you can sell the house and get a reasonable price for it. So we haven't seen a rise in foreclosure filings. There is also there's a 1-year moratorium on foreclosures for federally backed mortgages, which covers a lot of the market. Okay. So it has been fairly effective, combined with kind of jobs holding up. The rental problem is much bigger. So the federal government doesn't really have authority to tell landlords not to kick out their tenants. The eviction moratorium came from the CDC based on public health grounds. So the thinking was people being evicted from their apartments in a public health crisis, having to move in with family and friends, or becoming homeless increases the risk of people getting sick, right? So there's a clear public health reason for not having people have to move out of their apartments as long as the virus is still active. So the CDC imposed a temporary eviction moratorium, which has been extended a couple of times, but this is something that's very new. Evictions are processed through county court systems. And so there's been a lot of variation in how judges, even within the same state, have been interpreting the moratorium. There's a lot of difference in state law that protects tenants, whether or not, for instance, they have access to a lawyer when their landlord files for eviction proceedings. So we've seen really uneven kinds of implementation of this. Some tenants have been able to stay in their home, even if they're not able to pay rent, and they're kind of waiting and accumulating debt, but have not been pushed out. In some places, evictions have been going forward. The eviction moratorium also, it's a patchwork. So the landlord can't file for eviction and kick you out, but when your lease expires at the end of the year, the landlord doesn't have to renew the lease. And we've been in this situation long enough that a lot of people have just run out of their lease and the landlord doesn't renew it. And at that point you have to leave, right? And the moratorium doesn't do anything about that. So we haven't seen kind of a one-time cliff with people falling over and tens of thousands of evictions, but there's sort of this gradual process of people voluntarily leaving because they can't pay, running out of their lease and being told to leave, in some cases being evicted. We'll wind up with a lot of people who are displaced, but we're probably not going to have data that lets us track how many of those were sort of involuntarily displaced.
And I would just add to that we have really awful eviction data on from state to state. So there's no way of knowing how extensive that problem really is. And like I said, like each state has their own eviction laws. So so what counts as an eviction and all that kind of thing changes from state to state as well. So that's another problem that is associated with evictions too. So I think one of the biggest things that would be good is if we did start collecting better data on evictions. The other thing that's important is I think that all states should do, Nevada just came up with this law like a few years ago, that any kind of eviction proceedings that the person that's being evicted can actually have their records sealed so that it doesn't show up on a credit report. If you had more of that throughout many states, that might make people eligible to rent their new apartments easier, because credit agencies have this special service now that just deals with summary evictions. So all landlords cannot just check on your credit worthiness, they can check to see if you have evictions on your record. So to the extent that people recover their incomes, they still have evictions on their records, and it's making them less I guess, eligible tenants in any other place. So if you could actually get rid of like that dimension of it, I think that would actually help people too.
Yeah. Somebody just added an interesting sort of private solution, and this comes from the East Coast, New England, the Dartmouth University's Hitchcock Medical School in the Lebanon Upper Valley, New Hampshire, is building a 400-unit rental housing project for employees, so kind of providing their own solution. Are you seeing much of that, these sort of private or public-private partnerships as a way to try to help solve the problem?
We're seeing somewhat more interest from kind of larger employers, anchor institutions, hospitals getting involved with the housing sector. And actually, that's been going on for a while. So for instance, Kaiser Permanente has been focusing on how to provide more affordable housing or help their customers get into affordable housing, because being stably housed is a way of keeping people healthy, right? And so if you think about sort of the integrated set of solutions to take care of families, so hospitals, insurance companies are getting more interested in potentially providing some financing. Most employers don't want to be landlords. They don't want to be real estate developers. They don't want to be property managers. But for instance, the tech companies are throwing a bunch of money at solving kind of systemic housing problems, getting more interested in housing advocacy. Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon have all made commitments to affordable housing, and in some cases have set up kind of nonprofit organizations to acquire existing housing and own it, just to make sort of more housing available within the region. But it's, this is a massive problem. The private sector, either companies or nonprofits, can't substitute for public action, right? The government is in charge of solving social safety net problems because it's the only one with the scale and the scope to do this appropriately. So part of what we're seeing is disinvestment in the federal level, cutbacks on the funding for low-income housing subsidies, an unwillingness to tackle some of the underlying problems, including mortgage availability, including housing supply. All of this sort of comes due, and then the federal government comes up with a patchwork of solutions, none of which really fix the problem, and they're kind of taping things together and hoping that the market solves itself at some point.
Yeah.
I would also add to that the federal government, as they disinvest, they've also redefined this as more of a state and local issue, since a lot of the decisions for housing come from local areas or local communities. So states have been charged with doing this essentially. They have, again, like what you said, have a patchwork approach to this. They are actually coming up with their own programs, or they're using additional types of taxes, or making up funds from people buying single family homes. But it's never enough at the scale that would be necessary, and it's not a uniform policy. And every time, and it's kind of a problem for developers too, because if every time they go into a new state, they're subject to either new financing, new regulations, or having to engage local governments in order to make the relationship with the community in order to build these houses as well. So there's not any good national policy in that actually can help with making this a little bit more standardized, and also making it a little bit less risky even for developers to do this on an affordable scale.
Yeah. Jenny, here's one that was from a few moments ago, and it's a kind of a wonky question and I think it was a bit more on the commercial side than residential. And it's, I'm wondering how in cities on the West Coast that don't have strong CBDs, which I assume means a central business district, and with the decrease in demand for office space, what policies can cities and jurisdictions implement to incentivize that kind of dense development, where perhaps the standard urban model just doesn't naturally incentivize developers to build within these CBDs? and then preferably without tax abatements, smiley face.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because if we think about, going back to the climate crisis, what we really want is to enable people to drive less, to live in more climate-friendly neighborhoods, more climate-friendly homes. And so, cities that sprawl out horizontally are terrible for the environment, right? We'd like to encourage more of the job development in the urban core, more housing that's close by and adjacent to transit. In some cases, this is the same problem that we have so much local authority over development, right? So if it's super easy and cheap to build both housing and office space out in the suburbs, if you can build an office park and then a subdivision with 2,000 homes, faster and cheaper than you could build an apartment building and a vertical office building downtown, then that's what developers will do, right? So in some sense, the suburbs have too little regulation. Core urban areas have too much regulation, and that's pushing development to the wrong places from an environmental perspective, right?
Interesting.
That's the kind of thing where either state level action or more coordination at the regional level through, for instance, the MPOs, the regional planning organizations, that could help to provide a little bit more of a coherent strategy. Federal transportation money is allocated through these regional groups, so they have to come up with a strategy, but we don't really have an equivalent for housing, right? So one option would be, instead of giving local governments their allocation of community development block grants and so forth, give that to state or regional organizations and make them come up with a plan that makes sense for the region.
Okay.
The other thing that we could do that encourages more compact development is to do something like tax driving, right? Or a carbon tax that makes it expensive for people to live in large single family homes that take a lot of money to heat and cool, make it expensive for people to drive. And then that encourages consumers individually to start filling in.
Yeah. We've got about eight minutes left, and so I think it might be useful now to turn our attention to the future. What do you say as we come out of pandemic? What are the implications post-pandemic? There was a question, for example, about do we expect that companies will continue to allow people to work remotely? Then does that play into things? But what are you expecting for the short term, say in the next year or so, as we come out? What are the effects on housing and affordability?
Yeah, we're definitely going to have a period of uncertainty, and that's uncertainty for companies as well. So companies are trying to take the temperature of their employees and figure out what makes sense. Some employees would like to continue working remotely in the long run, and some really want to go back to the office. And so companies have to decide what to do, and they're not going to be able to make everybody happy. We're seeing more signals from some of the bigger companies that they will expect people to be back in the office at least couple of days a week. So certainly the finance companies are talking about that. Google is saying it expects its employees to be back in the office, I believe over the course of the summer, already bringing people back. So my suspicion is that at least in some industries where the face-to-face contact really is important for productivity, we're going to wind up going back to a job model that looks pretty similar to what we had before, maybe a little bit more flexibility, but people are still going to be in the office. And that suggests that probably both the commercial real estate market and housing markets will go back to something like they were before. I think one of the other pieces of uncertainty is, are people going to worry that we're going to have another pandemic, right? That we will have something like this that comes unexpectedly, but is a shock to the system.
Yeah.
I hope that governments are thinking about building safety nets that can respond quickly, right? It's really inefficient to have Congress vote on every stimulus package over a 1.5 year long crisis. There are ways that we can avoid that and have this become more automatic. That would be much better for people. And if we put in place financial support systems that allow people to adjust to something like this quickly, then you also encourage people, you can go back to a normal lifestyle, because if something bad happens, there's going to be a safety net there to catch you.
I'd like to add that I think it's kind of scary about the another pandemic. I read an article that talked about the fact that all kinds of climate change makes an increasing chance for even more types of pandemics. Just because we're invading habitats that we shouldn't be invading, there's more interactions with animals that could actually help spread new types of diseases. Plus, we're losing all the types of habitats that can help cleanse out some of these potential viruses. So climate change is something that we should also consider for also reducing pandemic potentials too. The other thing that's an unknown, I think, too, is if the new Biden plan that he talked about last night about having the pre-K and even the community college thing, that might change the dynamics and at least keep more lower income people at work longer, because they don't have to worry about childcare the same way that they used to, because that's a big expense for people, especially when their kids are young, that's a private responsibility for everybody. So if you alleviate that, that might actually help the housing market, because they would have a little bit more money in their pocket to afford a house, even if it was a little bit more expensive than they would like to pay. So.
Yeah, there's potentially a lot of sort of sideways solutions to housing affordability tucked away in some of these plans. So even something like in the stimulus plan, the expansion to the child tax credit and the ETC, that's more money for low-income families. If they have more money coming in through those tax credits, that helps them pay for everything from childcare, but also for things like housing and for healthcare, right? Yeah. So providing a stronger safety net helps everybody with their affordability across the board, even if it's not specifically housing assistance. The Biden campaign had a number of proposals around expanding housing vouchers. They have sort of a set of programs designed to push back on exclusionary zoning and encourage more supply. I'm not sure where those are going to go, but there's the potential to have some direct housing policy, and then all of the indirect stuff that just makes people's financial lives less stressful is going to be good.
Jenny, as you look ahead at your slate of work activities, either projects you're working on or things you're about to take on, what have you got on the docket that you're excited about that you're going to be working on next? What gets you excited?
Yeah. I have sort of two lines of work, both of which are going to continue. One is thinking about how we expand supply, and particularly how we make it easier and cheaper to build lower cost housing. This has been primarily a local issue, but state governments are getting more interested in playing a role. California has certainly had a lot of statewide zoning reforms on the docket. Massachusetts passed something this year. Connecticut is debating it. So I think there's room for state governments to take a more active role. And I'm trying to talk with a number of them to think about what that would look like. We need to tackle the fact that there isn't a housing safety net, that we've had these sort of bits and pieces, some public housing and some vouchers and some tax credits that don't cover people as well as they should. We need to think about ways to make that safety net more complete, potentially to get across some of these local boundaries, to be able to maybe acquire some existing housing in places where it's available, integrating things like improving the housing quality, right? We have a bunch of homeowners who live in homes with maintenance problems that they can't afford to pay for. So let's think holistically about the set of problems that are available. Let's look at the set of policies that we have and try to do sort of a full inventory of ways to make them more effective.
Yeah, excellent. And Karen, how about you? What have you got on the docket that you're excited about? Anything projects coming up that?
Well, we're kind of waiting for the census to finish, coming in, because we're going to update Rob's book, Robert Lang's book on boom burbs. So we only have the state level population for apportionment. So as soon as that other stuff comes out, we're going to be doing that. We're also talking about doing a book on, this is all politics, it's not housing necessarily. We're doing a book on the Electoral College that updates a book that was done by Neil Pierce, I don't know, a gazillion years ago, like in 1969 or something like that. So, given all the stuff that was going on, in the last election, one of the things that we're really looking at is trying to explore some of those issues and kind of give homage to Neil Pierce, who was a nationally syndicated reporter for the Washington Post. So,
yeah. Interesting. And then a final question quickly. So Jenny, are you looking forward to getting back out in the world? Are you in that camp, or are you in the camp of, I really liked working from home, I wouldn't mind doing more of this, or somewhere in between?
I'm halfway vaccinated at this point, and I am counting the days until I can go back to something like normal life. It's going to be very exciting. I'm looking forward to being able to see family who I haven't been able to see for a long time, and I will be perfectly happy to go into the office a couple days a week. Although I have to say my dog has gotten very used to having me around all the time, and that's going to be a negotiation.
Nice. Karen, how about you?
Well, I'm fully vaccinated, but I'm not, I just got my shot the other day. So I'm looking forward to doing both. I haven't been able to see my family either. So yeah, like we were trying to think about doing camping trips, and now I'm thinking more about getting on a plane again. Oh my God.
Yeah. I'm fully vaccinated, and I'm probably a little bit of both. I'm looking forward to some things I haven't been able to do, but I've really enjoyed also being able to work at home. The convenience has been really nice. And of course, I'm
And my
only
dog's not going to like it either. So
one block from campus, so I'm spoiled. All right. Well, thank you. We've come to the end of the appointed hour. Jenny, thank you so much for taking some time out from your busy schedule to do this with us. This has been a great conversation. And Karen, thank you for stepping in for Rob here at the last minute.
you're very
and doing
welcome.
a great job as my co-host. Thank you. And then also to Mary and Gerard, who we can see, the participants can't see them, and Sunny on the IT side, setting it up and watching over our shoulders just to make sure everything went well. And I hope our participants enjoyed it. We tried to get to as many of the questions as we could. Thank you for participating in this installment of CGU in Conversation. Take care, everyone, and be safe and be well.